Welcome back. I'll just wait a moment or two more. We're right at 1 o'clock. There we go. Now we're at 1:01. I will look to Ms. Medina. Are you ready for us to go back on the record?
I am, thank you.
Great, thank you. Um, I'll go ahead and orient us. Welcome back. It's the afternoon of Wednesday, September 18th. This is the afternoon portion of our hearing day with respect to the proposed Sites Reservoir project. We left off once again with cross-examination of the panel on fisheries. And Ms. Meserve, you were still in the middle of your cross. Before we jump right back in, is there anything else we should address before we go ahead and get back to it? And I'll ask my team to go ahead, please, and pin the appropriate attorneys and witnesses.
Good afternoon.
All right, back to you, Ms. Meserve, please.
Thank you, Hearing Officer Kinsey. Just to give a heads up for Mr. Hitchings and his management of his next panel, I think I'm within 10 or 20 minutes of being done, just so that you know. Thank you. Let's see. So I'm going to pick it back up with Mr. Spranza. We were talking about the adaptive management approach for the project. I think it would be helpful, Ms. Mullen, if you would not mind bringing up Mr. Spranza's testimony, which is Sites 103, paragraph 9, which is on page 5. And in this part of your testimony, Mr. Spranza, you are discussing a central component of the Delta Plan adaptive management strategy, which includes the administration by, on line 25, the reference to the Independent Science Board. And my first question is just whether, in your opinion, the Delta Plan strategy is effective that you're referencing here?
Mr. Spranza, you're on mute.
Thank you. Well, habits die hard. I think that the Delta Plan, the Delta Science Program, and Adaptive Management Plan are working towards their goals. No one is successful at everything. Not often is science successful early. And so I think it's yet to be determined just how successful that plan will be.
Okay. And I'm going to ask Ms. Mullen if you would please go to page 8 of your testimony, where on line 16 you discuss the two different components. Line 16 of the site's proposed adaptive management approach, which has the adaptive management science team, the AMS, and the adaptive management committee, the AMC, which I believe you were discussing somewhat with Mr. Mooney. And then on line 19, you mentioned independent scientific reviewers. Can you explain who you mean when you talk about independent scientific reviewers?
I can't identify specific people, but I can give you what I view as who would play a role in that. I think that we would have fisheries experts from our respective agencies. CDFW has some very good fisheries people that would be part of that. Same with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NIMS. I think we would have members from the Sacramento River science contractors, whether they're scientists or consultants that have a lot of experience on the Sacramento River. And there could be a situation where we have graduate students come up and, professors from Chico or Davis that do want to do research on the project effects and use the adaptive management program as part of that. That's kind of how I envision that.
If we could please, Ms. Mullen, go to CITES 136, which is the adaptive management plan. And that's page 40-5. So at that first paragraph identifies the AMS team for CITES. That would be employees of the authority and or contractors. Correct, Mr. Speranza?
I'm playing catch up. So the AMS team, let's see here. AMS team will be staffed by employees of the authority and or contractors who are empowered to collaborate with other science programs in the watershed and Delta. Yes.
Okay. And then if we could go to the next page, Ms. Mullen, the composition of the Adaptive Management Committee, or AMC, is listed down at the bottom paragraph. And do you see that, Mr. Speranza? It's talking about permitting, environmental planning and permitting managers from the agencies that are participating in the CITES Authority project, right?
Yes.
So how would these two teams that we just went over, how would they be independent like the Delta Science program that you reference in your testimony?
I think their independence would come from the participation of the other participants as we've identified them. So this would be folks from the Delta Science program, Sacramento River Science Partnership, maybe the Temperature Task Group. And although the adaptive management plan and program will be designed to refine operations based on those findings, it doesn't preclude other individuals from participating. I think the team is described as at a minimum would be other consultants and such. It doesn't really constrain it to that. So I can see your question. It's a good question, and the way it's written could be construed as it's limited. I don't think that's the intent, is to limit it. So with respect to independence, some of those individuals will work or be university professors. Some of those individuals could be like Mr. Hasrick working on Dr. Hasrick working on publishing papers, who would not be under contract to the authority. They would simply be participating in the overall research and science program, whether directly or in collaboration through their other groups.
So would the CITES approach to adaptive management have an independent science board like you referenced for the Delta plan?
It's not. It doesn't currently identify that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I have a couple of questions, Ms. Mullen, if you would not mind, please putting up AHO 279. And I did not see this referenced in the testimony, so I'll open it up to anyone on the panel. But this is the draft staff report for the Bay Delta update from September of 2023. Has anyone on the panel, is anyone on the panel familiar with this document?
I'm familiar with it. I read it. I didn't read all of it. Right. I made it's a pretty big document with references, but I read, I think, the overview or introduction and then browsed interesting sections.
Water Board greatest hits, right?
Right.
So as there are narrative objectives within this plan, in addition to the unimpaired flow requirement that's discussed. Is that something you're aware of, Mr. Speranza?
I'm aware they're there. I couldn't repeat them from memory. I would definitely need the reference and context.
Sure. Sure. And I don't have many questions about this, but I guess, Ms. Mullen, if we could go to PDF page 553, I'll just show an example. There's this first example is a narrative objective for the inflow to the Delta. And it discusses, let's see, it's that italicized language toward the top of the page. The quality of it doesn't look great, so I apologize. But it mentions flows that more closely mimic the natural hydrograph to which native fish species are adapted. And my first question was just whether any of the fisheries experts had considered the ability of the project to meet this narrative objective.
I could give an overview of it. I would refer to the species experts for any additional information. The overall, I think, purpose of the project was to build within the structure of higher winter flows a method to divert some of those higher winter flows, not to interfere with natural inflow patterns. So we're not building a rim dam here. It's off stream and would be pulling from those high winter flows. So that, to one extent, I think is a design feature that does incorporate a desire to retain historical hydrology that, to the extent it can, with rim dams for those fish. I also think things like the pulse flow protection, which is designed to preserve the cues, the perceived cues that salmonids, juvenile salmonids utilize to start their outmigration, as well as the Wilkins slough flow threshold to try and continue to preserve that downstream during our diversion seasons, October through June 14th. But I do think it's a component of it, yes.
Okay, but just to be clear, and correct me if I'm wrong, anyone on the panel, conformance or consistency with this particular objective, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong if I say it was not specifically considered in your testimony.
The 55, 45, and 65, that really goes.
No, I'm sorry. The mimicking the natural hydrograph conditions.
Oh, I do think that that was included in in consideration, and I think Dr. Wilder, Dr. Greenwood could expand on this, but as I said, that's the key measures of the pulse protection and diversions during high flows in the winter. I don't know, Marin, Dr.
But I
Greenwood.
guess my question, it's really more narrow. Thank you, Mr. Sprenza. It's really whether this particular objective was considered in developing your testimony.
I can speak first. I haven't specifically analyzed things in the manner that it's generally described there. I think there's different ways that could be interpreted as far as what you would look at if you were to quantitatively compare it, but it's not something that I was explicitly considering.
Thank you. And I'm just, in the interest of time, I apologize, but I have to make sure to not make Mr. Ruiz mad at me. Ms. Mullen, could you please put up the South Delta Water Agency Exhibit 72, if you don't mind? And it's going to be at pages 11 through 13. And I'm not sure if it would be Dr. Greenwood, but are you familiar with the site's historical water availability tool that is also an exhibit that was in our proceeding here that lets you look at some water years that are more recent? Let's see. So I guess, well, Dr. Greenwood, are you not looking at the screen, but thinking about the water availability tool, which this is based on? Is that something you're familiar with at all?
I've heard of it, but I don't know details regarding it.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. And I'm not going to ask you very specific questions about it, but this is testimony that we'll be presenting later from one of our experts. But what I wanted to point out was with respect to the mimicking the natural hydrograph. Dr. Greenwood, if as shown here in this example, the site's diversion would occur during the final significant Sacramento River pulse flow, would you think that mimicked the natural hydrograph?
I'm sorry, I'm trying to understand what we're actually looking at here. I think you were making a question in reference to this. Is there a legend that's
Yeah, and I'm sorry. So yeah, flow is the orange line, and this is an example of a water year. Let's look at the top one since we were looking at that before. Thank you. Water year 2001, and then the flow is the orange line, and the with diversion is the blue line, and then the site's diversion, you can see there is the black on the bottom, so you can kind of see when it would happen. And my question is, well, I'll stop there. Does that make sense to you, at least conceptually?
Sorry, could you, as far as the orange line, the flow, that was a representation of which flow? This is Verona, the location of
The
Verona, river flow,
correct.
but is this, I'm sorry, going back to the other exhibit we were just looking at, I thought that was speaking to, I can't remember the language. I don't think it was saying unimpaired, but whatever the word was that it was using, I don't know if we need to double check that, but essentially what I'm trying to get at is I'm not sure, is the orange line representing the term that the other exhibit was talking about, or is it representing something else?
Just, yeah, as background, I mean, I think what I'm going back to the inflow objective as an example of something that's in the draft staff report that we were looking at, which has this objective that we looked at about mimicking the natural hydrographic conditions that native fish are adapted to. And the question is, and again, and this was developed by Mr. Wilson using the tool I referenced, and just assuming that this is correct without you having to know that it is. I understand it's an exhibit of another witness. Doesn't this look like it would take off the part or divert part of what would be the final significant Sacramento River pulse flow of the winter?
Is the orange line what was referred to previously as the natural flow, or whatever the
It
term
was,
was?
and
Is
I
that
think you are potentially identifying a distinction. I'm kind of headed for something more general, but yes, we talked about mimicking the natural hydrograph as being the objective. And then this is just simply, I think, a representation of what the flow was in this location in that year.
But that would be then perhaps a representation of historical. I'm not sure if there's a distinction between natural and historical, but if this is and I don't know what the assumptions are regarding potential sites diversion. Did you mention that as part of your question? Is this
It uses
how
the tool, the water availability tool. I mean, I guess, yeah, just to maybe wrap it up, I'm trying to look at the natural, what is the hydrograph affiliated with the conditions without the project, and asking you about your opinion about diversions that may happen during what would otherwise be the last significant pulse flow.
As I mentioned, I'm not familiar with the tool, but if this tool as presented here on the figure is accurately reflecting site's operational criteria and so on relative to a representation of the flow that's in the river, then this is presumably the results of the model in terms of what could be potentially, as it indicates there, potentially diverted, and then what the resulting flow in the river would be. Looks like Verona in example year 2001.
Correct. Yeah. Would if that was the case with the site's diversion, would that be a deviation from the hydrograph of that being the last significant pulse flow?
Not sure about the word significant in that context, but just visually, there appear to be 4 large pulses of river flow there. There may be some smaller ones as well in places, but those are the larger ones. And based on what I'm seeing in the figure, the blue line representing with diversion, presumably meaning sites diversion. The blue line is somewhat lower. The peaks remain evident, but they are somewhat lower. It's difficult to visually discern the exact extent of what the diversions are as far as the resulting river flow. But the peaks remain, so there are still 4 main peaks with or without the site's diversion, if that's what the blue and the orange lines represent.
Okay, I think with that, thank you for humoring me, Dr. Greenwood, with this example. And with that, I will turn it back to the hearing officer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Meserve. I'm going to change my view here, hopefully, so I can see the room. There we go. Mr. Reese, did you have additional questions for this panel if you're on?
No, I don't have additional questions.
Thank you. So I think we've worked through the Delta water users. I guess I'll look at this point to representatives of the tribes. Is there anyone participating who has questions for this panel? And then I know, Mr. King, you had sent me some questions. So let me pull those up. Two sets, I think you had revised versions. Let's see. Excuse me while I pull those up. All right, so I will look to, and these are questions that I received from Mr. King. As I've mentioned before, we will post these to the FTP site once we've had a chance to work through them. The first set of questions are for Dr. Hasrick. And let me see. We don't have to go to the page. I'm just orienting myself. So it's with respect to paragraph 5 in your written testimony. And the question is whether you are aware of USGS studies. Are you aware of any USGS studies that document mercury in the effluent of the salt springs? Let me look to you, Mr. King. Which salt springs are you referring to? You're referring to the ones with respect to Funk's Creek?
Yeah, so I believe there's one in the Funks Creek watershed that was documented by C.F. Bergstresser in his 1968 report. And then there's another one that is in the West Sulphur Creek, which is documented by a 2013 USGS study.
So, Dr. Hasrick, are you aware of these USGS studies that referenced by Mr. King with respect to mercury in salt springs we'll start with on Funk's Creek?
I am not, but I think that this question would be better posed to Ms. Huber, who was the expert that provided that section of the report on the aquatic study plan.
And the presiding officer Kinsey, I asked Ms. Kinsey whether or not they've actually tested the Salt Lake effluent, and she said they did not have access.
I think you mean Ms. Huber, yes.
Ms. Huber, I'm sorry,
Okay.
Yes.
And then with respect to paragraph 7, can you describe, Mr. King, I think your question here is, as you phrase it, I'll just state it. Can you tell us why you assume that flows released from Funk's Reservoir is not project water? But Mr. King, can you clarify what you mean by the question? Which part of paragraph 7 do you mean?
Let me bring up this report. I think he has a statement. Maybe Dr. Hesser can to clarify that. He said, therefore, it's paragraph 7, last sentence. Therefore, Funk's Creek below the dam is not a reach of interest. and project water will be directed into the TC Canal upstream of Funk's Reservoir Dam. So I implied from that any flows that go over Funk's Reservoir Dam are not considered project water, and I wanted to understand why he made that assumption.
All right. So, Dr. Hasrick, did you understand the question as Mr. King asked it?
I did. And yeah, in that paragraph, I explained that the control of Funk's Reservoir as a regulating reservoir is under the control of the Tehama-Colusa Canal Authority, not the Sites Authority. And so it's that, the primary control is not with the Sites Authority there.
So if I'm asking my own follow-up question, if flows were, for example, be required to be passed through, I see flows below Funk's Dam, not below the Sites Reservoirs Dam. That's
Correct.
where I'm confused. Thank you.
Correct.
All right, let's see. The next question from Mr. King was whether, and I think this is to you, Dr. Hazard, if you know, will any Funk's Reservoir flows, Mr. King, do you mean Funk's Reservoir flows, or do you mean flows from the site's project authority?
Well, if water going over Funk's Dam into Funk's Creek is not project water, will those flows be used by GC Glen-Cluse Irrigation District for deliveries to Delavan Natural Wildlife Refuge?
All right. If you know, Dr. Hasrick, please answer that.
So these are flows going from Funk's Reservoir into the lower Funk's Creek that then go to GCID. I am not certain, but my understanding is that GCID siphons water into Funk's Creek rather than out of Funk's Creek. So I don't believe that to be the case.
And Dr. Hasrick, will there be an aquatic life study in Funk's Reservoir, or that encompasses Funk's Reservoir?
Not within Funk's Reservoir, for the same reasons, in that it's not controlled by the Sites Authority.
And then is it your understanding that as part of the project, Funk's Reservoir would be dredged?
I don't know about that.
Okay. So in paragraph 13 of your testimony, you reference, you discuss baseline conditions. After baseline conditions are obtained and evaluated, methods to determine stream flow to maintain fish in good condition will be reviewed based on their ability to maintain ecosystem and geomorphic function. Concurrence with CDFW, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and Colusa County will be obtained before a particular approach is adopted. Mr. King's question is whether you are stating here that Colusa County will be included in decisions to determine what Mr. King refers to as operational stream flows. What do you mean by that, Mr. King? Can you clarify your question?
So the question is which part of Colusa County will be included in determining operational stream flows? And then the follow-up is that do you believe they have capacity to participate in that manner?
Well, what do you mean by operational stream flows? You mean in Funk's Creek, flows in Funk's Creek?
Yes, it'd be operational stream flows from Funk's Creek and Stone Corral Creek.
Okay, so
This
is
is
it,
actually Stone Crowd.
Dr. Hazard, is it your understanding that Colusa County will participate in the decision to identify stream flows in Funks Creek? We'll start with Funks Creek.
So I'm a little confused as to what the definition of operational stream flows is. I can attempt to interpret that if you want, but maybe some clarity there.
Okay, yes. It's really whatever flows are necessary to maintain ecosystem and geomorphic function for
Okay.
those. Yep.
All right. To maintain fish in good condition. Yes. So what this is referring to is that findings will be shared with the fish agencies and with Colusa County, um, and consulted with those stakeholders before any kind of particular approach is adopted. So yes, I think in answer to his question, that would be the case.
And then had you identified a particular department of the Colusa County governance structure that the authority would consult with?
And I think that's outside the scope of my expertise. I'm here as a fish biologist, so
Understood.
that might be a question for somebody else.
And then you may have the same response, but in making the statement, did you, or to your knowledge, did the Sites Project Authority consider including tribal representatives or tribal consultation as part of this process?
Not explicitly in the study plan, as far as I'm aware, but yeah, I can't answer beyond that.
All right, thank you. And then with respect to paragraph 15, let's go ahead, if we could please bring up sites 60 on page 14, although I'm not sure it's the PDF page. And I'm going to hand this over to you, Mr. King, once we get this up with respect to table 2.
I know that is this I don't, did I say site 60 in it? This is I'm talking about the Cortine, the Yates. This is
Right.
reference to the Yates. So it's either there's a site. See which both he and I included that in. It's site 60. Yeah, be site 60.
Yeah, and we look
But
at
he represented. Oh, okay. I thought this reference was Yates 1989. Can we bring up King 36 in?
King 36.
Yeah.
And what is King 36?
It's Yates. It's his. He cited Yates 1989 report. It's the same report, the water quality and supply in Cortina Creek. If you go to page 14.
Wait, hold on. I'm trying to figure out what is the difference between King 36 and Site 60?
Site 60 is the aquatic study, but he cited Yates 1989. This is Yates 1989.
Understood. Thank you.
So if we can bring up page 14, not PDF page, page 14. So table 2.
Right.
Keep on going down. Yeah.
It said 36/14 at the top of the page we were looking at.
Right, that's PDF. I'm talking about page PDF 18. Here it is. Just table 2.
Okay.
Right, and there's a list of different creeks and their specific conductance, including Stone Corral. My question to Dr. Husrick is whether or not he was aware of this observation of specific conductance by Yates in 1979.
Could you help me get to exactly what observation you're talking about? Could you put that?
It's site number. So this is the water quality of selected streams along the west side of the Sacramento Valley in Yates 1989. If you look at site number 3, Stone Corral Creek,
Uh-huh.
the observation date on April 17th, 1979 had a specific conductance of 1800.
Yep.
So my question is, are you aware of this level observation of specific conductance in Stone Corral?
I'm aware generally that that EC levels or specific conductance was high in both of these creeks and in the past, and we also measured higher EC levels, which precluded us from doing certain fish, we like electrofishing, right, to survey the creek. So generally, I'm aware that specific conductance was higher.
Right. Well, thank you.
Thank you. I think we can take that down. Thank you, Ms. Mullen. And then with respect to paragraph 17, Dr. Hasrick, are you aware that this is as represented by Mr. King, that the lower reach of Stone Corral Creek includes riparian areas in the Delavan National Wildlife Refuge?
So again, could you clarify the reach? Because our aquatic study plan is limited to the reaches of interest that essentially, at least in this creek, end at the TCC. So any lower reaches are essentially, I mean, they become agricultural diversions, and so they're again are out of control of site's authority. So I don't know how far down you're talking about, but we're not considering lower reaches of Stone Corral Creek.
Could I ask you to, can I refer to the aquatic study to further give background for my question? If we could bring up site 60, page 18.
Okay.
You go to the bottom of that, the last sentence of the last paragraph. So my question really concerns your determination of reaches based off of the physical characteristics as defined in the aquatic study, specifically the last sentence of the last paragraph. It talks about, so the first part of that paragraph talks about both creeks, and then
Hold on, can we
Yeah.
zoom in on this? You're talking about the last paragraph, Mr. King?
Yeah, last paragraph, yep.
Please, thank you.
So the references to both creeks, but so they refers to both creeks, both Stone Corral and Funks. Also, both experience much of their natural hydrograph, albeit altered due to local conveyance and fluvial geomorphic process, and provide water and sediment that ultimately flows in occlusive basin drain during rain events. So my first question is knowing these physical characteristics, do you believe that you appropriately define the reach for the aquatic study for Funks Creek and Stone Corral Creek?
Yes, I do.
Okay. This clearly says that this water and sediment ultimately flows in occlusive basin drain. Are you aware that that Funks Creek joins Stone Corral Creek in the Delavan National Wildlife Refuge?
I'm aware that Funks Creek is a tributary to Stone Corral Creek. I was not aware that it was in the Delavan Wildlife Refuge.
Okay. And then are you aware that the Stone Corral Creek exits the Delavan National Wildlife Refuge before it enters the before it conjoins the Calloosa Basin Green?
No.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. King. I think we can, well, let's leave this up for now. With respect to paragraph 17 and 18, first I'm going to look to you, Mr. King, for clarity. I'll read the question. The question is there any consideration of the impact on aquatic life at the confluence of the proposed Dunnigan pipeline and Bird Creek? Can you clarify that for me, Mr. King? Because we were there at the site visit. I
Right.
didn't think the Dunnigan pipeline flowed into Bird Creek. I thought it flowed into the Calloosa Basin drain. Is that not your understanding?
Yes, it was a you are right, and I meant Dunnigan, Dunnigan Pipeline, the confluence of Dunnigan Pipeline at Bird, the confluence of Dunnigan Pipeline in the Calloosa Basin Drain at Bird Creek. So the question is that worthy of an aquatic life study, since water will be entering the Calloosa Basin Drain at that point?
So, Dr. Hazrick, did you consider, with respect to your testimony, potential impacts on aquatic life at we'll call it the confluence or the discharge maybe of the proposed Dunnigan pipeline to the Calloosa Basin drain?
And no, I didn't.
All right, with that, thank you, Dr. Hazrick. I think we were turning to Dr. Unger. So that would be, looks like we don't have to bring it up, but Cites 55 is Dr. Unger's testimony. And the question from Mr. King is whether you considered in your testimony that the sites diversions from the Sacramento River would be expected to, well, I'll hand this to you, Mr. King, again. I might need your help to decipher it.
Thank you. So, Dr. Unger, are you aware that there will be reduced flows in the Sacramento River because of the diversions for the TC Canal and Glen Close Irrigation District? Are you aware of that? Yes, you are. Right. Correct. Right.
Times, yes.
Yes. And then are you aware that those reduced flows will reduce flows into the Molten Weir and the Calloosa Weir?
Objection, lacks foundation.
Fair. So, Mr. King, I know we were on site, which is good. Remind me where the Molten Weir is, please.
We didn't see the Molten Weir, but it's actually on the Sacramento River in Calloosa County below the Glen Calloosa diversion point. And it's a question I asked Mr. The person who was the expert on the CV sim, and he mentioned that he expected a reduction of 10,000 acre feet for the Molten Weir flows and approximately 50,000 acre feet for the Calloosa Weir flows.
I remember that exchange. So, Mr. Ferguson, what was your objection? Or Mr. Hitchings?
Sorry, it was me, Your Honor, Andrew Hitchings. It was lack of foundation because the foundation hadn't been laid. It was just stated that as a fact, as part of the question.
Understood. So I think now, Dr. Unger, to you.
I think those reductions depend on the time of year, but and I don't know the specific amount of flows reductions, what they are. I'd have to consult the modeling outputs for that.
Do you know if you considered that? Does your testimony or your modeling, do you know if it's been considered or not?
Yes, flows over molten weir and the other Sutter bypass weirs, how they affect inundation in the Sutter bypass was definitely considered.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Unger. We are now to you, Mr. Speranza.
And I think Dr. Curdy asked probably questions 1 and 2. And I was wondering if I could ask with the question 3 and with a little bit of permutation on that. So, Mr. Speranza, does the adaptive management process as it now exists, does that include consideration for downstream flows from Stone Corral and Funk's Creek?
To the extent that those flows would be influenced by Dr. Hasrick's work on the aquatic study plan that are required to keep fish in good condition per earlier conversations.
Is there any consideration for maintaining sustainability of the Colusa subbasin? Does the adaptive management plans that currently exist have any consideration for maintaining sustainability of the Colusa subbasin, or if you're aware of that?
The adaptive management plan looks at the operational effects of the project on the Sacramento River and downstream of the diversions, not on groundwater basins. I believe that was Dr. Davis's or Mr. David's area of expertise.
Would the adaptive management science team or the adaptive management committee include any representatives of the Colusa Groundwater Authority?
I couldn't say at this point. It certainly was envisioned to have more of a fisheries, aquatics component, but the Sites Authority Board can make decisions in the future. So I couldn't really say yes or no to that.
But if those flows affected groundwater sustainability, would that be a justification to include the Colusa Groundwater Authority?
Objection, vague, calls for speculation.
Yeah. Okay. Then my last question is, will the Colusa or Glen tribal entities be included in the adaptive management science team or the adaptive management committee?
As previously discussed, the authority has already expressed its interest to include tribes within its within the project decision-making process, whether it's through consultation. So I would certainly expect it to be considered, if not a component of it.
One last question: would the adaptive management committee be subject to the Brown Act and open meeting, the open meeting requirements under the Brown Act?
Objection, calls for legal conclusion.
Okay.
Sustained.
All right. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer Kinsey, for taking my questions.
Thank you, Mr. King. I think with that, I have a few questions, but very few, and I'm trying to track. I think they're all for Dr. Greenwood, and aren't very many. Just bear with me and I'll orient myself. So Dr. Greenwood, in paragraph, this came up in your cross-examination, but in paragraph 14 of your testimony, you refer to mitigation measure WQ 2.2, prevent net detrimental metal and pesticide effects associated with moving Calusa Basin drain water through the Yolo bypass. My question is whether WQ 2.2, does that describe the evaluation that would occur as to whether or not there would be a net benefit to fish?
Are you referring to specifics on the methods for assessing the net benefit, or?
When I let me back up. When I looked at mitigation measure 2.2, I believe in this citation, I think there was just one or two sentences saying that an evaluation would occur. And I'm wondering if there's somewhere I should look for more detail about what the evaluation would be, or if that's yet to be written, yet to be decided.
Yes, I'm not aware of any more detail on that, to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you. And then I had another question in paragraph 20. Again, it's really a clarification question. In paragraph 20, you refer to the statement that the project would operate in a manner that would not adversely affect the ability of other entities to meet all applicable requirements. And then in the next sentence, this includes 44,500 CFS April to May minimum flows per SWP ITP delta outflow requirements. What is this 44,500 CFS? Are you minimum? I'm just not aware of this minimum. I'm wondering where what your understanding of it is.
Yes, this would be, and I may have kind of abbreviated it obviously from the full description of it, but this is a requirement from the 2020 State Water Project incidental take permit, which I think I mentioned earlier as part of testimony that this was part of the sort of the baseline that's already existing. And so I raise it in this context just to indicate that this is an example of a requirement that others have to meet, and therefore that the site's authority would not adversely affect, the project would not adversely affect the ability to meet that. And I brought it up in this context because it was specific to longfin smelt.
So is it your understanding, and Mr. Hitchings or Mr. Ferguson, you're welcome to object or redirect me if you need to, but I want to get to the bottom. Is it your understanding, Dr. Greenwood, that sites would not divert in April and May when flows are below 44,500 CFS at wherever? I don't know where the measurement point is, but I gather it's with respect to the outflow requirements.
It's delta outflow, and just to clarify, that's in place at the time of diversion occurs. So I was meaning that I raised that in relation to what's currently in place. Now, at the time in the future, that may not be something that's actually in place, but I brought it up there just given that it was part of the like I said, the baseline conditions, as it were, and the project was modeled to operate to that.
Okay, thank you. I don't have anything else. I think with that, I'll look to you, Mr. Hitchings and Mr. Ferguson. Do you have redirect for your witnesses?
Yes, we do have a little bit of limited redirect, probably only about 5 minutes or so.
Great, then let's go ahead.
Okay, thank you. First couple questions are for Dr. Wilder. Dr. Wilder, do you recall Monday's questioning by Mr. Busher regarding your views of certain stressors on Delta smelt and winter run Chinook salmon?
Yes.
And do you recall generally identifying dams as one of those stressors?
Yes.
Were you referring to all dams when you generally identified them in that context?
No, I was specifically referring to rim dams across natural river channels. I was not referring to dams for off-stream storage reservoirs such as sites.
Okay, thank you. Also, on Monday's questioning, and when I say Monday, I'm referring to 2 days ago, so this week. Do you recall questioning by Mr. Busher about the emigration period for juvenile green sturgeon?
Yes.
And do you recall your answer to that?
Yeah. Yes. I erroneously stated that it was summer to fall-ish, when I should have stated that it was the October to March time period.
Okay, and then do you recall Monday's questioning by Mr. Spain regarding whether there were any criteria or events that would trigger reclamation's use of sites water in exchange for leaving more water in Shasta Reservoir for temperature management, and whether there was any written guidance for those circumstances?
Yes.
And do you recall general responses from the witness panel that information about how such triggers were modeled could be found in the final EIR/EIS and possibly the ITP, incidental take permit modeling appendices?
Yes.
And could you please describe in more detail where this information can be found in the AHO or sites exhibits and provide a brief summary?
Sure. A description of how the exchanges were modeled can be found in Exhibit AHO 114, which is the final environmental impact report, environmental impact statement, Appendix 5A1, and it's called Modeling Assumptions. And then also in Exhibit Sites 121, which is the incidental take permit application for operations, and specifically Appendix 4A, called Surface Water Resources Modeling.
Okay, thank you. And then I have a few questions for Dr. Greenwood next. Dr. Greenwood, do you recall Monday's questioning by Mr. Schutz generally regarding the potential positive effects from Shasta temperature management actions on winter run Chinook salmon, and where the assumptions related to those actions are described?
I do.
And in your responses, I believe you indicated that there typically would be a modeling assumptions document appendix, but that you couldn't recall where that would be for the incidental take permit for operations. Is that correct?
It is.
Have you had an opportunity to review the documentation? And if so, can you please confirm the exhibit number, which includes any such modeling assumptions?
I've had an opportunity to review the documentation. I believe the relevant document describing the assumptions is Exhibit Sites 121, which is the incidental take permit application for operations, Appendix 4A.
Thank you, Dr. Greenwood. And then just a couple of last questions for Mr. Spranza. Mr. Spranza, do you recall Monday's questioning by Mr. Schutz regarding whether it is the position of the site's authority that CDFW's ITP would be the enforcement mechanism for the Wilkins Slough bypass flow requirements for sites diversions?
I do.
And are you aware whether the sites authority has proposed any permit terms or conditions under which the State Water Board could also enforce those bypass flow requirements?
Yes, I am. The Sites Authority has proposed site-specific permit term requiring sites to comply with the terms of any ITP issued for the project. And the State Water Board could enforce such compliance. I would refer to sites AHO 25, which is the written testimony of Wesley Walker, and sites 70C, which is Angela Bizzoni's written testimony at page 9.
Great. And I just a point of correction, the AHO Exhibit 25, that's actually part of the water right application materials that sets forth the site-specific permit terms. Is that correct?
You are. I confused the sites versus the AHO. Thank you.
Okay, that's all we have on redirect. Thank you.
Thank you. With that redirect, I will look to the room, and I'll try to remember what order I went in before. I think we started with Mr. Busher. Do you have any recross for these witnesses?
I believe Mr. Busher had a mediation today and is not here.
Is not here. Okay, well, Mr. Schutz, do you have any additional follow-up questions?
I do have a couple of questions. First, for Dr. Wilder, you just gave a citation to AHO, Exhibit AHO 114, which is Appendix 5A1, I believe, of the final EIS. Do you have a page number cite for me, please?
I do not, although there's a table, if I'm getting the document correct, maybe about 30 pages in.
Okay. And do you have a site for the a page number site for the sites 121, the ITP modeling for me?
I do not. I apologize.
Dr. Greenwood, same question to you on sites 121.
I don't have a site, I'm afraid.
Ms. Kinsey, could we ask these witnesses to provide that in some fashion? I don't know what the best or most appropriate one would be, but I'd like to better understand what they're referring to. Sites 121 I just pulled up, it's like 130 pages or something. And I really want to know what they're referring to.
Mr. Hitchings or Mr. Ferguson, would you be willing to ask the witnesses to find a pin site and circulate that?
Yes, we will do that.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Schutz. And then Mr. Spain.
I had the same questions as Mr. Schutz. I think the answer would satisfy us both.
Thank you. Mr. Mooney?
None here.
Thank you. Mr. Fisher? If he's still with us. Ms. Meserve, do you have any follow-up?
No, thank you.
Thank you. And I'll stop here. I think Mr. King is out of time. I have a follow-up question because I'm still confused, but I don't think it's actually for these witnesses. So we'll see how we deal with this. I'm frankly still, I am very interested also to understand how the exchanges were, at least how they were modeled. And I had actually already found and looked at the reference to AHO 114, Appendix 5A1. And there is some description there of, so I guess this may be a question for you, Mr. Hitchings and Mr. Ferguson, to take back. There are descriptions here of some of the parameters of when these exchanges might occur, but it's still not clear to me, and I'm not a modeler, but it's still not clear to me when the model would, so to speak, decide to back up water in Shasta rather than backup water in Shasta and release sites water instead? Was that how does that actually functionally work in the model? And again, I'm not a modeler, but I and the hearing team have looked at this and can't figure it out. And that I assume is a question for the modelers, would be in a better position to explain it. But part of the source of my question is whether an independent expert modeler would have enough information when looking at AHO 114 to recreate the model results. And maybe it's there, and I'm like I said, I'm not trained in these things. I have some experience with models, but I'm not trained in these things. So I'm putting you on the spot, Mr. Hitchings and Mr. Ferguson. I'd like to avoid, there's no need to bring back witnesses if we don't have to, but it may be that at some point we do want to talk to the modelers again, but maybe this is a question you can bring back to them if there's another place we should look for information. And I don't know how well I'm articulating the question, but that really is the frame of my question is, how does the model decide when to conduct an exchange, which probably isn't model speak for how that works. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we will add that to our homework assignment and circulate the information.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. With that, I think we've completed our hearing from this panel. I want to really thank the witnesses. I know it was you've been here a lot about many hours, and I really appreciate your testimony and responses to all the questions. And it's 2:12. Maybe we should go ahead and take this opportunity to take a 10-minute break while we assemble your next panel. So we'll come back at 2:22.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, it's 2:22. Ms. Medina, are you ready for us to go back on the record?
I am, thank you.
Great. And Ms. Mendel-Rice, I thought of you during the break because I had scheduled you in, and I think I would like to give you that opportunity. Would you like to make your opening statement at this time?
I would, thank you.
Please go ahead.
Hearing Officer Kinsey and members of the board, my name is Jenna Mandel-Rice, and I'm appearing on behalf of the State Water Contractors. The State Water Contractors is a nonprofit organization representing 27 of the 29 public water entities that hold long-term water supply contracts with California Department of Water Resources for the delivery of water from the State Water Project. State Water Contractors member agencies use State Water Project water to provide municipal, industrial, and agricultural water supplies to 27 million Californians and 750,000 acres of agricultural land. State Water Contractors recognizes the multi-benefit storage projects, such as the proposed Sites Reservoir, are essential to prepare and adapt California and its water portfolio for a rapidly changing climate. Projects such as the proposed Sites Reservoir capture and store storm flows, providing flood control benefits while also increasing the water supply available to meet environmental and consumptive needs. These projects are critically important. At the same time, State Water Contractors must protect its members' significant long-term investments in the State Water Project and its reliability. In light of this, the State Water Contractors initially protested the Sites Reservoir application on the basis that the Sites Authority's application to divert excess flows from the Sacramento River and local creeks could impact water rights held by the Department of Water Resources for the State Water Project. State Water Contractors resolved its protest through an agreement with the Authority and Department of Water Resources. While the State Water Contractors are not presenting a case in chief in this hearing, I would like to take this opportunity to emphasize two important points that are supported by the evidence and the testimony already before you. The first point is that the State Water Contractors' concerns regarding sites' potential to impact senior State Water Project water rights are only resolved to the extent that the board includes in the permit the two permit terms that were agreed to between the State Water Contractors, the Department of Water Resources, and Sites Authority. As demonstrated in the record, the first permit term is a replacement for the proposed permit term for the protection of State Water Project and Central Valley Project that was set forth in Appendix H of the site's application. Department of Water Resources, Bureau of Reclamation, the Authority, and the State Water Contractors have all expressed support for the replacement of the originally proposed term with the modified term. The replacement permit term is protective of the State Water Project water rights because it precludes sites diversions when Reclamation and the Department of Water Resources have declared the Delta to be in balanced water conditions under the Coordinated Operations Agreement, and it eliminates exceptions to when sites could divert when the Delta is in balanced water conditions. The replacement permit term also precludes sites diversions when the diversion of water could adversely affect the operation of the Central Valley Project and/or the State Water Project. This provision protects against a broader scope of adverse effects to State Water Project water rights and prevents sites diversions that would interfere with State Water Project and/or Central Valley Project compliance with regulatory obligations. The second permit term agreed to by sites, DWR, and the State Water Contractors is a new permit term that requires that all sites diversions are consistent with the agreement between State Water Contractors, the Authority, and the Department of Water Resources. State Water Contractors believes that with these permit terms, the site's project can be operated in a manner that does not interfere with the Department of Water Resources' exercise of its senior water rights for the State Water Project. The second point that I would like to emphasize, and that has already been demonstrated in the testimony, is that the Sites Reservoir is not a State Water Project facility. Sites and the State Water Project facilities should not be confused. As such, the evidence does not support any term or permit conditions that would restrict, impair, or affect the Department of Water Resources operations of the State Water Project. Thank you very much for your time today and your flexibility in allowing me to make this opening statement out of sequence.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. With that, I will turn back to you, Mr. Hitchings and Mr. Ferguson. Are you prepared to bring up your next panel of witnesses?
Yes, thank you. I believe our witnesses for panel 7 are on the platform.
Great.
Ms. Lisa Weber and Ms. Jennifer Hale. There we go. I think we're all front and center here.
Great. I will go ahead. If you would please come off mute, I will administer the oath. Please raise your right hand. And Ms. Hale, if you can come off, I can do both at the same time, but you have to come off mute too. Working on it. Sometimes spacebar works, but not always. Click on, let's see.
There we go.
There we go. Got it. Please
Sorry.
raise your right hand. Ms. Weber and Ms. Hale, do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Please go ahead, Mr. Hitchings.
Yes, thank you again. And just to give a little context, the purpose of this panel is to describe and explain the potential terrestrial impacts of the Sites Reservoir project, including potential impacts to land cover types, special status plants, and wildlife and related mitigation measures, best management practices, and management plans that are related to those issues. And we will start with Ms. Weber and then move on to Ms. Hale to summarize their testimony. Ms. Weber, thank you for being here this afternoon. Would you please state your full name for the record?
Lisa Weber.
And you understand that you are presenting your testimony under oath, correct?
Yes.
And is Exhibit Cites 113C a true and accurate statement of your written testimony?
Yes.
And did you prepare that written testimony?
I did.
And is Exhibit Cites 185 an accurate statement of your qualifications?
Yes.
Do Exhibit Cites 186 through 198 that were submitted with and cited within your written testimony include true and correct copies of documentation related to your analysis of the potential terrestrial impacts of the Sites Reservoir project to land cover resources, aquatic resources, and botanical resources?
Yes, they do.
And is Exhibit Cites 277 a true and accurate summary presentation of your written testimony?
Yes.
Did you prepare that summary presentation?
I did.
Thank you. At this time, would you please summarize your written testimony as set forth in Cites 277?
Yes, if we can bring up that document, please. Great, thank you. Good afternoon, Hearing Officer Kinsey and Ms. Mullen and everyone on the call. I'm Lisa Weber, and this is a summary of my written testimony. Next slide, please, Ms. Mullen. I'll briefly describe the methods used for mapping land cover and aquatic resources and for assessing botanical resources in preparation of the draft and final EIR/EIS for the Sites Reservoir project. I'll also describe the impacts and mitigation for these resources. Lastly, I'll provide a summary of recent field surveys we've conducted. Next slide, please. We did not have access to the project area for the preparation of the EIR/EIS, and so we mapped land cover types throughout over 26,700 acre area based on aerial photograph interpretation, which is a standard practice for large projects where on-the-ground access is not available. This approach is adequate for disclosing impacts in a CEQA document, but it does require follow-up with ground truthing for project permitting. We use several resources to develop the mapping, including the North of Delta off-stream storage project that partially overlapped with the current project area, and that was conducted over a period of several years with field access. And this was used in the 2017 draft EIR-EIS. We compared this mapping with aerial imagery from a range of years for comparison with a focus on recent imagery. We also consulted soil survey data, National Wetland Inventory maps, and the National Hydrography data set. The mapping approach included detailed methods with regard to defining the edge of riparian, distinguishing wetland riparian from upland riparian, distinguishing oak savanna from oak woodland, and noting the presence of pines where they were discernible in the photos. Next slide, please. We mapped wetlands and non-wetland waters as part of the land cover mapping effort in the same area and using the same imagery and resources. But we also used world imagery that the Army Corps of Engineers provided. Our focus was on the imagery from the wettest recent time periods available, and we compared that with imagery from recent drier time periods. At the time we were doing the mapping, the most recent wet time periods were March 2016 and May 2017. We identified wetlands in aerial photos by their photo signature and also used soil maps to target areas that might support wetlands. As with other land cover mapping, we followed some specific definitions. Within drainages, for example, if we could observe vegetation cover over 30% within the drainage, the area was mapped as a wetland rather than a non-wetland water. For mapping the ordinary high water mark of drainages, which is the Corps' limit of jurisdiction from the imagery, we used several approaches, including visible shadows in the photos and breaks in elevation profiles obtained in Google Earth. We also used street views in Google Earth where they were available to distinguish culverts and bridges. Next slide, please. The EIR-EIS also assessed botanical resources, including special status plants. For this assessment, we reviewed the botanical field surveys conducted by DWR in the early 2000s as part of the North of Delta Offstream project. To update this information, we used current California Natural Diversity Database and California Native Plant Society inventory data. Based on DWR's surveys, where they had on-the-ground access, and the updates, we identified 2 federally listed species, Keck's checkerbloom and palmate bracted bird's beak, that were documented in or near the project area. For these 2 listed species, we developed models to help predict locations of potentially occupied habitat. The models combined the land cover mapping with soil survey data for the soil map units on which known locations of these species occur. The special status plant data and the species modeled provided sufficient information to disclose and likely overestimate the potential impacts on special status plants. But mitigation in the EIR-EIS requires on-the-ground surveys to find actual occurrences of all special status species in the project area. Next slide, please. The EIR-EIS assessed direct, permanent, and temporary construction impacts on riparian, perennial grassland, oak savanna, and oak woodland communities as mapped in the project area. The EIR-EIS includes mitigation for confirming and refining the desktop mapping. The field surveys are now underway. I'll come back to that. The EIR-EIS also identifies best management practices, or BMPs, that would be implemented as part of the project to minimize both direct and indirect impacts. The BMPs include multiple stormwater pollution prevention plans, and for specific site conditions, and the spill prevention, containment, and countermeasure plan. The EIR-EIS requires compensatory mitigation for unavoidable impacts on riparian and other sensitive communities and oak woodland. Riparian and oak savanna and oak woodland impacts would be long-term because of the time, potentially long-term because of the time required to replace mature trees. Next slide, please. The EIR/EIS also assessed direct, permanent, and temporary construction impacts on the aquatic resources that were mapped in the project area. As with the sensitive natural communities, the EIR/EIS includes mitigation for confirming and refining the desktop mapping of aquatic resources and identifies BMPs and compensatory mitigation for the unavoidable impacts. I also want to note that the EIR/EIS provided minimum compensatory ratios, and other details of mitigation, but the final mitigation ratios and the type of mitigation will be determined as part of the permitting process. With the plans and mitigation required in the EIR/EIS, the construction impacts on aquatic resources will not be unreasonably adverse. Next slide, please. Now I'll summarize the on-site operation impacts on these resources. These impacts would result from the development and use of recreation areas that are part of the project and that would be operated under the Recreation Management Plan, as described in the EIR/EIS. Operation impacts also include project maintenance activities. These would be regulated by this RMP, a land management plan, and BMPs that protect riparian and other sensitive natural communities and aquatic resources. The first two bullets on this slide should have also included oak woodland. That was my error in excluding. Operation of the reservoir would involve changes in water surface elevations in the reservoir as well. Next slide, please. Off-site operation impacts on riparian and other sensitive natural communities and on aquatic resources were evaluated in the EIR/EIS and further described in the final EIR/EIS responses to comments. The off-site operation impacts were evaluated based on the conclusions of the hydrology modeling using CalSim-2 and groundwater modeling, which has been discussed in earlier testimonies during these hearings. The modeling conclusions were that the project would cause minor changes in Sacramento River volume on average, particularly during dry periods, and minor changes in groundwater elevations. With only minor changes in flow, the river elevations were predicted to vary from existing conditions by less than 1/10 of a foot, as explained in earlier testimony, which would not cause measurable effects on existing riparian along the river or side channels. The modeling also concluded that project operation would cause minimal changes in flows to and within the Yolo and Sutter bypasses, and in the Colusa Basin Drain. The EIR/EIS hydrology assessment concluded that project operation would not have substantial effects on flows in the drain due to the inputs it receives from multiple creeks and agricultural runoff. My assessment concluded that riparian habitats along the Colusa Basin Drain would not be reduced by project operation. Next slide, please. As I described earlier, models were created to estimate occupied habitat for the federally listed palmate-bracted birdsbeak and Keck's checkerbloom. In the EIR/EIS, the extent of the resulting modeled habitat was used as the potential impact area for each species. The EIR/EIS also identified special status plant species that were previously found in the study area and other special status species that have suitable habitat in the study area and are known to occur in the region. The EIR/EIS assessed direct construction impacts on the potential habitats for special status plants based on the land cover mapping in the project area, and included mitigation for conducting on-the-ground surveys according to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife standards. As with the other resources I've discussed, the EIR/EIS identifies BMPs and compensatory mitigation for unavoidable impacts. With the plans and mitigation required in the EIR/EIS, the construction impacts on special status plants will not be unreasonably adverse. Next slide, please. Potential operation impacts related to special status plants on site would include the use of recreation areas and maintenance activities. Recreation areas would be operated under the Recreation Management Plan, and project maintenance activities would be conducted according to measures in the RMP, the Land Management Plan, and BMPs that protect special status plants and other sensitive biological resources. Next slide, please. Since the EIR/EIS was written, we've obtained owner permission to access several properties totaling nearly 1,000 acres. As I mentioned earlier, we have conducted surveys in accordance with the mitigation measures related to confirming land cover mapping on the ground, delineating aquatic resources, and conducting special status plant surveys. We've also met with regulatory agencies on one of the properties to verify the aquatic resources delineation fieldwork. Next slide, please. And in conclusion, the construction and operation impacts of the Sites Reservoir project on riparian and other sensitive natural communities, aquatic resources, and special status plants would not be unreasonably adverse with implementation of the mitigation measures, BMPs, and plans described in the EIR/EIS. And that concludes my testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Weber.
Thank you, Ms. Weber. Our next witness is Ms. Jennifer Hale. Good afternoon, Ms. Hale.
Good afternoon.
Could you please state your full name for the record?
Jennifer Hale.
And you understand that you are presenting your testimony under oath, correct?
Yes.
And is Exhibit Cites 114 a true and accurate statement of your written testimony?
Yes, it is.
Did you prepare that written testimony?
Yes, I did.
And do you have any corrections to make to that testimony?
I do. I just had two small citation errors that I noticed. One was on page 5, line 12, where it said AHO 707. That was supposed to be AHO 077. And then also on page 5, line 17, it should have, it said CNDDB parentheses sites dash 158 comma sites dash 159, and that should have been CNDDB parentheses sites dash 158 eBird comma eBird sites dash 159.
Thank you. And for the record, we can submit an errata with a correction to that if that would be helpful.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Hale, is Exhibit Cites 154 an accurate statement of your qualifications?
Yes.
And do Exhibit Cites 155 through 161 that are submitted with and cited within your written testimony, do they include true and correct copies of documentation related to your analysis of the potential terrestrial impacts of the Sites Reservoir project to special status wildlife and wildlife movement corridors?
Yes.
Is Exhibit Cites 264 a true and accurate summary presentation of your written testimony?
Yes, it is.
Did you prepare that summary presentation?
Yes, I did.
Okay, thank you. Then at this time, could you please summarize your written testimony as set forth in Cites 264?
Yes. So as I mentioned, my name is Jennifer Hale. I'm a senior wildlife biologist with ICF, and this is a summary of my testimony. Next slide. I will give a brief overview of my testimony, and then I will describe the assessment methods for wildlife, including the environmental baseline, impact analysis methods for wildlife, wildlife impacts, best management practices, management plans, and mitigation measures, and my conclusion. Next slide, please. My testimony is primarily based on the final EIR/EIS and will provide support for my conclusion that best management practices, the land management plan, the recreation management plan, and mitigation measures will protect special status wildlife species and their habitats, and any potential effects mostly will not be unreasonably adverse. Next slide, please. I evaluated potential wildlife resources in the study area by reviewing existing information. I reviewed California Natural Diversity Database records within 5 miles of the study area to conservatively ensure that any special status wildlife that is known to occur in the vicinity of the project was identified. I also reviewed the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service species list, recent and historical aerial imagery in Google Earth, species distribution, habitat association, and habitat requirement information from numerous sources, habitat connectivity layers in the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's online map viewer, and locations of special status birds and eBird. Based on this review, 42 wildlife species were identified. 9 of the species were eliminated from further review based on a lack of suitable habitat or the study area being outside the known range of the species. I considered these 9 species to have low to no potential to occur in the study area. The remaining 33 species were assessed, and I'll define study area in a few slides when I discuss my impact analysis methods. Next slide, please. My assessment methods also included identifying potentially suitable habitat with geographic information system modeling. My colleagues and I prepared species model descriptions for the 33 species with potential to occur. The species model descriptions discuss the land cover types the species is associated with, the model assumptions, and the rationales for the assumptions. Using the assumptions and rationales from the model descriptions, we created a list of potentially suitable land cover types for each species. These land cover types were then modeled using GIS software to identify areas of potential habitat for most species in the study area. I say most because no modeling was done for Antioch dunes and Sacramento anthracite beetles because suitable habitat for these species is limited to areas along the Sacramento River and was conservatively assumed to be present in the limited project footprint along the river. In general, the models overestimate the amounts of suitable habitat present. Next slide, please. I reviewed but did not use information about the presence of wildlife species and their habitats from surveys conducted between 1998 and 2004 and in 2010 to 2011 because this data was between 10 and 23 years old. Additionally, past surveys were conducted for different project footprints and frequently did not provide specific location information, making it unclear whether the data were relevant to the study area. All wildlife species for which past surveys were conducted, for example, bald eagle and bank swallow, were included in my impact analysis. I did not conclude that these species would not occur or be affected by the project. Next slide, please. Information used to establish the environmental baseline were the existing information described previously, the land cover descriptions, and information from habitat modeling. Sufficient baseline information was provided to conduct an impact analysis and propose mitigation measures. ICF biologists conducted focused pre-construction bird surveys in geotechnical boring investigation locations in 2020 and 2021. During preparation of the final EIR/EIS in 2022, ICF biologists conducted surveys for golden eagle territories within a 4-mile survey area. In 2023, they also conducted ground surveys and monitoring of known eagle nests from public roads where geotechnical investigation work locations were planned. Eagle nesting surveys were also conducted in 2024. Other surveys for wildlife and habitat could not be conducted due to lack of landowner access permission. Aerial imagery review and habitat modeling are common practices to evaluate impacts when there's a lack of property owner access for field surveys. Next slide, please. So moving on to the impact analysis methods. Impacts were based on the environmental characteristics of the study area and the expected magnitude, intensity, and duration of activities related to construction and operation of the project. The study area for wildlife resources consisted of a 300-foot wide area beyond the permanent and temporary impact areas for construction-related impacts. Potential effects beyond 300 feet, such as those that might affect raptors, were addressed through mitigation, which requires surveys and no disturbance buffers that are larger than 300 feet. For potential operation impacts, the study area also included the Sacramento River between the Red Bluff pumping plant and the Delta, the Sutter Bypass, and the Yolo Bypass. When assessing impacts, the entirety of the land cover that is potential habitat for a wildlife species was considered affected, even when specific habitat requirements may be absent. In other words, impacts are overestimated. For example, the entirety of riparian habitat was assumed to contain elderberry shrubs that are occupied by valley elderberry longhorn beetle, when elderberry shrubs likely do not occur in every riparian area, and all elderberry shrubs are unlikely to be occupied by the beetle. Similar assumptions were made for other species where all potentially suitable habitat was assumed to be impacted, when some of these areas likely lack required habitat features and/or are not occupied by the species. I assessed impacts on 33 species with low to moderate to high potential to occur. Next slide, please. Construction impacts include both construction of facilities and filling of sites reservoir. Impacts on special status wildlife habitats were determined by overlaying GIS data of the project footprint and temporary impact areas on the modeled species habitat to quantify permanent and temporary impacts. Permanent impacts on special status wildlife habitat consisted of the portions of modeled habitat that would be converted by project construction. Temporary impacts on wildlife habitat were divided into short-term and long-term temporary impacts. Short-term was defined as less than 1 year, and long-term temporary impacts were defined as 1 to 5 years of disturbance. Short-term temporary impacts were calculated as temporary impacts, while long-term temporary impacts were calculated as permanent impacts in the impact analysis. Impacts on individuals was assumed if modeled habitat was affected. This approach is conservative and overestimates impacts. Operation impacts are impacts related to water diversion to the reservoir, maintenance, and use of recreation areas. Next slide. For potential impacts to wildlife corridors, I reviewed the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's California Essential Habitat Connectivity Project Mapping and the Areas of Conservation Emphasis Viewer. I determined the types of habitat connectivity areas and corridors that exist in the study area and assessed the project's effects on wildlife corridors and connectivity. I determined the types of habitat connectivity areas and corridors that exist in the study area. Oh, sorry, I already said that. There are multiple natural landscape blocks, small natural areas, low priority linkages, and essential connectivity areas in and near the study area. In addition, portions Portions of the study area are identified as irreplaceable and essential corridors, conservation planning linkages, and connections with implementation flexibility. Next slide, please. I identified a number of potential impacts on special status wildlife from construction, including permanent and temporary losses of habitat, injury or mortality of individuals, disruption of breeding and foraging activities and dispersal, and the others listed here. Implementation of best management practices, management plans, and mitigation will reduce construction impacts, and project construction would not result in unreasonable adverse effects on wildlife species. Next slide, please. Similarly, I identified a number of potential impacts on special status wildlife from operation of the project, including impacts that result from hydrologic changes as a result of changes in topography, habitat loss or disturbance from maintenance activities, and injury or mortality from vehicle strikes by maintenance workers or recreational visitors. Next slide, please. Other potential operation impacts include introduction of exotic species from visitors to recreation areas, minor changes in the geomorphic regime and existing river geomorphic characteristics of the greater Sacramento River system, and limited inundation of low elevation parcels in the upper Yolo bypass. Next slide, please. Additional potential operation impacts include potential disturbance of nesting birds during maintenance activities, illness or mortality of bald eagle from consumption of fish that have bioaccumulated methylmercury, and potential illness or mortality of bats from ingesting cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins if harmful algal blooms occur in the reservoir. Best management practices, management plans, and mitigation will reduce operational impacts, and project operation would not result in unreasonable adverse effects on wildlife species. Next slide, please. Potential impacts on wildlife corridors and movements are modification of movement pathways to avoid lighted areas, impeded movement and increased potential for mortality from new roadways, and habitat fragmentation and impeded movement from the presence of the new reservoir. Some of this habitat fragmentation would be within natural landscape blocks and essential connectivity areas identified in the California Essential Habitat Project mapping. BMPs and mitigation will reduce impacts. For example, mitigation requires wildlife crossing at new roadways to be constructed, monitored, and maintained. It is indeterminate if the project would result in unreasonable adverse effects on wildlife corridors and movement. Next slide, please. Best management practices will be implemented as part of the project to avoid or minimize some of the potential impacts on special status wildlife. BMPs include stormwater pollution and spill prevention plans, designing water conveyance systems to maintain existing hydrology, directional lighting and shielding, and construction measures like worker training and biological monitoring. Next slide, please. The land management plan addresses management and maintenance activities on non-recreation lands. It provides general measures and practices when working in or near wildlife habitat and specifies when pre-activity surveys or monitoring is required. The recreation management plan addresses management of recreation lands. It specifies where signs, fencing, or other deterrents are needed to avoid or minimize human intrusion into habitat. Next slide, please. Project mitigation measures require actions to avoid, minimize, rectify, reduce, eliminate, or compensate for impacts on special status species and their habitats. Avoidance and minimization mitigation requires actions that lessen disturbance of habitat and special status species. For example, prohibiting the removal of trees containing active bird nests and disturbance of active nests, and implementing practices to avoid raptors colliding with transmission lines. The proposed avoidance and minimization measures follow U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and California Department of Fish and Wildlife written guidance. Avoidance and minimization mitigation requires implementation prior to the adverse effect, such as surveys that must occur before construction, thus being able to mitigate the effect before it occurs. Compensatory mitigation consists of mitigation credits, habitat creation, or habitat enhancement and preservation. For example, for eagle nest trees and loss of oak woodland. All compensatory mitigation describes performance standards that are required to be met. Next slide, please. My conclusion is that with implementation of project elements and mitigation, the project's construction and operation will largely not result in unreasonably adverse impacts on special status wildlife species and wildlife movement corridors. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hale.
Yes, and Hearing Officer Kinsey, that concludes the summary of the direct testimony for this panel.
Thank you, Mr. Hitchings. I will turn to the collective coordinating NGO parties. Do you have questions for this panel, and do you have a representative who will be going first? Mr. Mooney, you came off mute the fastest. We'll look to you.
Thank you. I will start off with kind of a question for both of you, for Ms. Weber. Can you tell me how do you define, what's your definition of unreasonable adverse effects?
Yeah. So because the impacts are all ultimately mitigated, the difference being some are long-term for some of the woody vegetation, and all others are mitigated, in CEQA language, they're mitigated to less than significant. For some of the habitat types, they're potentially long-term because of the time needed to establish a mature forest. But depending on the form of mitigation that's taken, because that, there were several options given in the mitigation measures. Purchase of mitigation bank credits, for instance, would provide a quicker return.
And your definition, does it, in terms of unreasonable adverse effects on say species, does it make a difference if a species listed as threatened or endangered?
The mitigation is still there, whether the species is specifically federally or state listed, or whether it's a California rare plant rank. I mean, the mitigation will vary between those, but
the mitigation doesn't. The mitigation doesn't. Is it your testimony that the mitigation essentially avoids all the impacts if it's, say, a endangered species?
No, there's levels of mitigation. First off, there's, avoid it if at all possible, and minimize. And then finally, it's compensatory mitigation if impacts remain.
Okay. And so is it, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth here, but is it safe to say that the term unreasonable adverse effects, you're using that in the CEQA context?
Not precisely. It's a little different from CEQA. yeah, I understand there's kind of a disconnect there. If we want to kind of bridge to CEQA, less than significant with mitigation. But as I mentioned, there were 2 impacts that were considered significant and unavoidable because they were long-term impacts, not because they couldn't be mitigated, but because the effect potentially could be long-term.
Okay. And so you don't make any distinction between whether or not it's a species that maybe is in abundance versus a threatened or endangered species or species of special concern?
Not in the mitigation in the document. Ultimately, that will also be part of the biological opinion and the permitting process.
Okay. So would there be a different standard than for the incidental take permit?
A different standard?
In terms of unreasonable adverse effects? I mean, is it, you found that there is no unreasonable adverse effects in a number of areas. Would that standard apply different? You kind of talked about how in the CEQA context, but say in the incidental take permit for some of the species.
I'm not sure. I don't think a different standard would apply. I mean, that it's up to the service.
And Ms. Hale, would you have I mean, do you agree with Ms. Weber's statements, and would you have anything to add to that?
So my definition was an effect would not be unreasonably adverse if it would not jeopardize the continued existence of a threatened or endangered species. And I also took into account if the measures would be sufficient to avoid, minimize, rectify, reduce, eliminate, and compensate for effects. So I did take into account, the species status. I think that species that are listed, that there's more application there because they're more imperiled. We did have a lot of input from the wildlife agencies in regards to our models. They commented on the draft EIR, and we took into account their comments and recommendations and made changes to our measures based on their input. So yeah, I kind of took all of those things into account when making that unreasonableness determination.
Okay. So for you, it's not so much of just trying to clarify, it's not so much of a CEQA term or CEQA application of CEQA. It was something more than
so
that.
Much, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ms. Weber, on page 3 of your testimony, I guess we could put that up, which is cites
113.
113. Thank you.
Excuse me, it's actually 113C because there was an errata.
Thank you.
I will represent to you, I have 113 in front of me. So if I do not have the errata in front of me. So if I ask you a question that would implicate the errata, please let me know.
Okay.
On page 3, on around line 16, you talk about the mapped 28 land cover types in approximately 26,766 acre project study area.
Yes.
What was there any validation of the mapping cover types?
Validation.
Like ground validation?
That's what's currently underway. That's was a mitigation measure in the EIR, EIS. And as I say, that's part of what we're doing with the on-the-ground surveys, is confirming that the mapping from aerials is correct. And we've already made, a few small changes to that.
Okay. So, and when is it expected that I mean, is it the intent to validate the entire, to go over the 26,000 acres, or are you just kind of doing it, spot checking it?
No, well, so the 26,000, that was what we had mapped in completion, which included 3 alternatives of the project. So some of that area is not relevant any longer. But within the area that is part of the project alternative that will be moving forward, we are doing, as we get access to individual landowners' property, we do the full surveys for everything, for all the land cover types, as well as the delineation of aquatic resources and the special status plant surveys.
Is there a reason why, well, when you originally did this, you didn't have access to the private property, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And now you've had access to 1,000 acres of private property, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. What changed that afforded you access to that 1,000 acres?
There's ongoing coordination with landowners. It's a very involved process. It originated with getting access for the name has flown out of my head. Does anyone have the name of that? Where they're doing the drilling to assess, in limited areas, they're doing drilling to assess geologic conditions. And so as they got access for those properties, we were able to expand that to access to the full property for our surveys. But it is an ongoing, there's a full team involved with coordinating with landowners. I believe it's a contractual type of agreement with each landowner.
What year did you start working on the mapping?
On the ground or aerial?
Just the work that you started doing on this. What year when was that?
2020.
Okay. And at that time, did you request that Sites Authority ask for access to the private property?
Well, it wasn't up to me personally, but yes, the team would have preferred, and it just was not feasible. Also, within the term of the time to create a CEQA document, the timing wouldn't have worked.
Okay. The timing wouldn't have worked because there wasn't enough time with the preparation of the CEQA document?
Correct.
It's my understanding that the notice of preparation, supplemental notice of preparation, was done in 2017. Is that correct?
I'm not sure.
And do you know when the draft EIR was released?
Was 2022? I don't have that in my head, but
2022, 2021, that time frame?
2021, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And do you know when the final EIR was released?
It was either 2022 or 2023.
Can I represent to you that it was November of 2023?
Okay. Thank you.
And so in that 6 years of CEQA analysis, there wasn't adequate time to request access to private property?
That's not within my purview.
Okay.
And I don't know about the timing of the notice of intent. Work on the CEQA document began in 2020.
Okay. Thank you. When you did the mapping, did you do any surveys by public roads without accessing private property?
No, there's a high level of respect for the community there. And so in order to, I was not part of the decisions on that, but no, we were not able to access public roads.
Did somebody tell you that you couldn't go look for surveying or validation of the mapping by accessing public roads?
Yes.
Okay. And do you know who that was?
Not precisely. It was a decision of the authority. That was the general guidance for people working on the document.
So just so I have this clear, so the authority, someone, or the message from the authority was that in doing your mapping and validation and your surveying, that you were precluded from going to the site on public, with public access. You were precluded from going to the site.
Yes.
And Ms. Hale, is that your understanding as well, is in terms of access to the public property, public access to the site?
Yes, we were told that we shouldn't survey from any public roads to avoid, landowners asking us questions and causing more potential issues for the project. So
What potential issues were they concerned about?
I just think some of the landowners are not in favor of the project, so they just didn't want to create any additional tension. They didn't want to put us in that situation. So
Would it, and I'll ask it to both of you, would it have been beneficial to your surveying and studying had you been allowed to go access the site from public access roads?
I'll go first. Partially, but really there are very few roads going through this area compared to the extent of the open space around. So viewing it from the road would give some information, but really much of this area is very remote and requires access to private properties and roads thereon, and then hiking throughout the properties.
Ms. Hale?
Yeah, it it would have helped. I agree with Lisa. It would have helped some, but not as much as having full access to a property. But sometimes we can't do that. I mean, that's happened with other projects as well. And so then we rely on the aerial imagery review.
Since you've done your testimony or did these reports, other than the 1,000 acres that you've done, where there's been some sounds like some boring and testing, test boring taking place, have either of you been out to the property or to the property site?
Well, we went on a tour, probably similar to the one that this group went on recently, to see the facilities. So we have seen, all the diversion facilities and parts of the canals, areas that were viewable from public roads, like the town of sites.
Did that tour? But that would it be safe to say that tour didn't really involve surveys, viewing for birds, ground truthing, the work that you've done on the modeling? Is that safe to say?
Yes, for me. Jennifer would have to address the bird side of things. Ms.
Yeah,
Hale.
I mean, it was just like a 2-day site visit. So we saw what we could see. Some of my other colleagues have been involved in the Golden Eagle surveys, so they've been out to do surveys from roads in that context, but I have not been involved in those.
And you both relied heavily on the California Natural Diversity Database, is that correct?
I wouldn't say heavily. It's part of what we both included in our analysis.
Is it your understanding that the California Natural Diversity Database is based upon people reporting sightings?
Correct.
Yes.
Is that the only way that occurrences are reported to that?
I think you can report that you surveyed an area and did not find something, but the records are based on they're based on positive occurrences. So.
Okay. And so the remoteness of this area, would you expect that there be limited reporting in the California Natural Diversity Database as opposed to species at the project site?
Yeah, typically private property tends to have less information, so in remote areas.
I will add, however, that the earlier surveys that were done like in the late 90s, early 2000s, they did have access back at that time. And I believe some of those have resulted in records in the CNDDB.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know if there's any nearby lands to the project site that are publicly accessible where you could have worked to validate the mapped cover types?
No, I think one could look at nearby areas, but that is not going to necessarily inform precisely what's in the survey area.
Okay. Do you have an estimate of how much error there is in the, say, the GIS land cover layer, or the work that you've done? Is there a error rate that you would anticipate, or based upon the 1,000 acres that you have done that you've discovered?
I don't have an error rate. I'm not sure how one would calculate that precisely. We did find some differences. And that's primarily, and this was expected, primarily in the aquatic resources delineation. There was some area that was not really visible on the aerial imagery, but as a percentage, I don't have a number for that. It would be relatively small.
Ms. Hale, would you have a similar answer, or do you have a response to that?
I'd have to lean on Lisa since she's did the land cover mapping and has been out on site to kind of ground truth some of it.
Okay. On page 6 of your testimony, Ms. Weber, lines 22 to 26, you discuss developed a habitat models to predict occurrences of text checker bloom and palmate bractic bird's beak. I might not be pronouncing those right.
That's right.
Were these models validated for accuracy?
That is part of the ground truthing, if I understand you correctly.
Okay. So is that, so in the 1,000 acres that you've had access to, has that been part of the area where this modeling would cover? Or have you had a chance at that 1,000 acres to do that ground truthing or validation of it?
Yes, in the 1,000 acres, we have conducted special status plant surveys in spring and, well, in blooming periods that include these species. And they were not found. but the area that we have access to is not necessarily, there wouldn't have been likely suitable habitat for the palmate bracted birdsbeak. And I don't believe it was an area previous where Keck's checker bloom was previously noted in earlier surveys.
So is it accurate to say that given the lack of access to the project site, you haven't had a chance to sufficiently validate the models?
Could you explain what you mean by validate the models?
Or just checking them for accuracy? You know, if the model would tell you that you would, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming that the model tells you where you could expect the species maybe in abundance, and then you would go out there and look, and if you found the species there that the model predicted it, that would provide some accuracy. If you started finding it in places that the model didn't predict, that would indicate maybe the model wasn't as accurate. Is that,
I see,
clarify it?
Yes, thank you. And can you repeat what the question was originally? Whether or not
Me, I was going to say, now you're asking me to exercise my short-term memory, and I'm not sure.
I know.
Is it accurate to say that because of the lack of access to the project site, I mean, you still got some 291,000 acres, right?
Less
or
than
what
that.
is it? No,
Yeah.
28,000 acres, not 200, 28,000 acres. With that lack of access, is it accurate to say that with that lack of access, you haven't had the opportunity to determine the accuracy, to sufficiently determine the accuracy of the models or model?
I would say that is correct, with the caveat that the model was not presented as stating this is where the species are going to be. It's a probability that this is where there's potential suitable habitat that might be occupied by this species. And I'm sure it way overestimated occupied habitat. And that can really only be confirmed with on-the-ground surveys.
On page 7, at the end of page 7 on your testimony, line 27 over to the next page, you describe some limited quantification of the extent of the perennial grassland patches within the mapped polygons of annual grassland. Do you recall where this work was performed?
This was, let's see, could we go, I think maybe go to the next page. Is that where that statement is, please? I think we're looking at line 2. 2 and 3, is that what you're referring to?
Well, you say it says that you just identified several perennial grassland areas of less than 1 acre in extent within several hundred acres of mapped annual grassland during field work conducted in 2023 and 2024.
Yes.
And so I'm asking, where was that field work done?
The specific properties, are we able to state that? I mean, I can tell you, I just want to make sure that it's okay.
I'm not aware of any
I don't.
that would apply, so I think Mr. Hitchings, unless you have an objection.
Well, to be honest, I don't know if there is any contractual limit on that. So I don't know.
Let me ask this, Mr. Mooney, why do you want to know? And is there a way to ask this somewhat more generally?
I'm happy to ask it more generally, and if Mr. Hitchings also wants to report back at some point, whether or not there's a problem, there's an issue, but I'm just trying to figure out where they've had, I mean, the ground truthing that they've done, where they've had access to, and I could maybe ask, is this part of the 1,000 acres that you were talking about earlier in your testimony?
Yes, this is referring to areas that we had access to in 2023 and 2024 and where we have been conducting the surveys.
Okay. And did you prepare a report based upon this, or a memorandum of some sort?
We prepare summaries of each survey. Each survey day has a summary form for it where we state what was observed.
And are those summaries available to the public?
I don't know. I don't believe so. I think that's internal. We have not yet determined what is going to be prepared as an overall report. And what the frequency of that reporting will be.
And when do you expect to prepare that report? Is there a time frame?
I've not been given a time frame yet. No.
Okay. On page 8, line 9, there's the discussion that the BMPs that you refer to, BMP 12 and BMP 13, would ensure that impacts are not unreasonably adverse. Can you explain? And it's my understanding that BMP 12 and BMP 13 have to do with the stormwater pollution prevention plan and a spill prevention plan. Can you explain to me how those BMPs would ensure that there's no unreasonable adverse impacts to sensitive natural communities and special status species of plants that are within the reservoirs that are being actually inundated by the reservoir?
Well, this particular section is not talking about the special status plants, just to note that. Okay. And that primarily the BMPs are to protect areas from erosion and sedimentation, outside of the project area. Okay. And I will say that perhaps my testimony somewhat misstated this. It's not just the BMPs, it's the BMPs and the mitigation measures.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you covered this in your testimony, but I just want to make sure. On page 8, lines 16 to 21, it states, for upland riparian and oak savanna communities, however, the removal of mature trees would be a long-term impact because of the length of time that would be required for newly planted trees to reach mature size and fully replace the habitat function and habitat value of the removed trees. So would you consider that that long-term, that extensive long-term losses of upland, riparian, and oak savanna to be unreasonably adverse?
Well, that's what I talked about when you were first asking about unreasonably adverse, and that these are long-term impacts, potentially long-term impacts, but they're not permanent. And that's why I applied that not unreasonably adverse label to it. And not for oak woodlands, but for riparian, only because I don't think that there are any mitigation banks for oak woodlands, but I could be wrong there. For riparian habitat, those impacts could be short-term if there are mitigation bank credits available for those habitats.
Okay. I think that's all I have for Ms. Weber, and I'll turn my attention to you, Ms. Hale. On your testimony, which is cites 114, you state on page 3, you're talking about the lines 5 through 12 about the focus surveys for birds where the access was granted. Access was granted for the geotechnical boring investigations. Is it you or ICF performed bird surveys when you had access there? Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Do you recall what species of birds were detected there?
The only one that I believe was that I can remember offhand, because I'm pretty sure I put it in the EIR, was northern harrier, but there might have been a bald eagle that was observed also. It's been like probably 4 years since I inquired about those surveys. So
when were those surveys? There are surveys on the 1,000 acres done.
So the 1,000 acres surveys were primarily just for the land cover. Oh, I can't say it for sure. I've been there's other biologists that have been involved in the wildlife surveys at sites, and I've just not been in the loop with what's been done. So I'm not entirely sure what's been done for wildlife on those 1,000 acres.
I'm sorry, did you say when it was done?
The original surveys for the geotechnical borings were in 2020 and 2021.
Okay. So you haven't had access to that area since 2020 or 2021. Is that correct?
We have access to the acres that Lisa discussed. I'm just not aware of what wildlife surveys have been conducted in those areas, if any. I just have not been involved in those and have not been briefed on any of that. I worked on the EIR, EIS, and that was kind of my role on this project, and I have not been involved in the surveys that have been going on.
And you said when you observed northern harrier?
Again, so this was not me. This was other biologists that were there on site prior to the boring that did the pre-construction bird surveys.
And the northern harrier is a species of special concern?
Yes.
Is there a reason why on Appendix 10A, Table 10A-1 of the final EIR/EIS, Northern Harrier is not listed?
I believe it is listed. It is a species that we evaluated.
Is can we? I didn't write down the. It's the AOH 158, I believe.
Which appendix were you looking for, Mr. Mooney?
Appendix 10A.
Okay. Sounds about right. Let's see. Yep. Okay. So it is AHO 158, it looks like. Please, Ms. Moon.
Northern
Thank you.
Harrier is in the table on page 10A-23.
It is not listed on 10A-1, table 10A-1, though. Is that correct?
10A-1 might be the CNDDB list, but this table is the table of species that were evaluated.
Okay. Thank you. That clarifies that for me.
Sure.
You indicated in your testimony that 9 species were omitted from the table 10-1, and do you recall what species were omitted or some of the species?
They were the ones that are in the table that's up right now that say something either like no potential or low potential. So one of them is Wilbur Springs minute moss beetle that was a species that I said had low potential. The Blenosperma vernal pool and dreaded bee. California tiger salamander was a low to none. Foothill yellow-legged frog.
Okay.
May I have a repetition of the species?
Oh, do you want me to say them again?
The last one, red tail something.
California tiger I said California tiger salamander and then foothill yellow-legged frog.
Thank you.
And what was in the
do you want me
basis?
to do you want me to state all 9 or are you good?
I'm good. That's fine. I guess we can compare this. We can compare, but was the basis for removing them because of the low occurrence?
Yes. So the low potential to occur based on the habitat present, the presence or the absence of habitat, the range of the species, known occurrences, elevation, all those things came into play with determining the potential for occurrence.
But again, that was not based upon any on-site surveys.
Correct.
That had been performed by ICF.
Correct.
I just kind of noticed the time, and I don't remember if we took a break yet since.
We took one. I think we came back at 2:22. So break soon
Okay,
would be good. Is this a good time for you to break?
it'd be a good time for me, and then I probably have another 15 minutes or so, and 20
Okay.
minutes, and like Ms. Meserve said, if in the break I can review it and
Great.
cut it down a little bit, I'll try to do that.
Sounds good. Let's go ahead and break for 10 minutes. We'll come back at 4:02.
Lisa, I just saw Rachel's text.
Dina, are you ready for us to go back on the record?
I am, thank you.
Thank you. With that, I will hand it back over to you, Mr. Mooney.
Thank you. Ms. Hale, on page 5, line 20s and 20 to 21 of your testimony, you say the previous older survey information, 1998 to 2004, 2010, 2011, was reviewed for informational purposes, but was not used for making determinations. And in any event, its inclusion would not have changed the species that were considered in the FEIR EIS or the analysis of impacts on these species. Why was it not used? Why was that older information not utilized?
Partly because it was so old, and partly because in the past the project was in different areas, and it was really hard to tell from the reports when they had location information for species where it was relevant to the current project. I just couldn't, there wasn't much that I could get from it because it wasn't specific enough.
But was it surveys that had been taken, surveys that had been on the ground surveys?
Yes.
And did you have any other on the ground surveys to access?
No. But the surveys for all of the species that they surveyed for, we assessed those surveys, or we assessed those species. We included those species in the analysis. We assessed impacts on those species. We didn't try to exclude any of them. So that was what I meant by it didn't, not using that data didn't change anything with our analysis. We still address those species.
Could it have helped you to determine the level of occurrence of the species by relying upon those surveys?
10 to 23 years old is pretty old. For some species, it might have, for others, maybe not. Typically, that's, you would want to resurvey areas when the surveys are that old. So.
But again, you weren't able to survey, correct?
Correct.
I'm going to skip back to page 4, lines 27, 28. Where you say, because the models were limited in part by the accuracy of aerial imagery, interpretation, and the inability to field verify the land cover mapping because of the lack of property access, the models generally overestimate the amount of potential habitat in the study area for one or more species. Maybe you covered this a little bit in your opening, but how is it that they overestimated as opposed to not knowing that they didn't underestimate the amount of potential habitat?
We were very inclusive when we were assigning land cover types to the various species. So if any land cover type had any potential to provide habitat, we included it. So in doing that, we overestimated suitable habitat for species rather than underestimated it.
But again, you haven't been able to do any kind of ground truthing on that. Is that correct?
Correct. Other than like the the golden eagle, the eagle surveys, the bald eagle and golden eagle surveys that I mentioned. And then some surveys that may have occurred in the area where the botanists have been doing surveys, but I'm not in the loop without what's happening in those areas.
Okay. And you made reference to the Golden Eagle surveys. Are those surveys? And they're referenced in page 6, footnote 2. Are those surveys public? Have they been made public?
I don't think that they are. I believe there's a survey report for maybe the 2022 surveys. But I do not know if those are publicly available.
Do you know if they're not publicly available? Do you know if it's the intention to make them publicly available?
I do not know. The Sites Authority would have to answer that.
Okay. But they have not been included in the evidence as part of your testimony. Is that correct?
Correct.
That your testimony is based upon those surveys?
My testimony is based on my knowledge that those surveys have been done.
Did you review those surveys in preparation of your testimony?
I reviewed the one report that I could find, and then I just know, because the biologist is a colleague of mine, that the surveys have been ongoing this year.
The biologist that's a colleague of your mind means the biologist also works for ICF?
Correct.
Okay. But you didn't, and did that biologist assist you in the preparation of your testimony?
No.
But just so I'm clear, but in preparation, you've made reference to an Eagle survey, but in preparation of your testimony, you did not review that survey?
I don't know what you mean by review that survey, because the survey is an action that he did, so I can't review it. Are you talking about a report?
Well, okay, so somebody went out and did a survey,
Mm-hmm.
and they wrote some information down on paper or a tablet or something, correct?
No, it was it was in a conversation that he said that they were doing Eagle surveys for sites this year. So
okay.
The only written report that I saw, I believe, was from the 2022 surveys.
Okay. And what did he tell you about the Eagle survey that that the biologist had done?
Nothing really. It was a conversation about scheduling work, and he said that he couldn't work on certain days because he was doing Eagle surveys for sites.
And did he tell you what the results of those surveys were?
No.
And what was and do you know the date of those? Do you know the date of when he was conducting those surveys?
I don't remember. It was a conversation that we had many months ago, so I don't remember.
And it was a conversation you had prior to your testimony, prior to have dropped in your written testimony?
Yes.
Okay. And did you ask him, so you didn't ask him what the results of the survey were?
No, because the conversation was just about planning work, and not specifically about sites. So.
And since you've prepared your written testimony, have you had subsequent conversations with that biologist?
No.
Okay. On page 8, lines 5 and 8, 5 to 8, you state, for example, the entirety of riparian habitat was assumed to contain elderberry shrubs that are occupied by valley elderberry, longhorn beetle, when elderberry shrubs likely do not occur in every riparian area, and all elderberry shrubs are unlikely to be occupied by the beetle. Is it reasonable to expect that elderberry shrubs to grow in the exact places kind of forever?
Well, I mean, we expect them to occur in, generally in riparian habitat, but not necessarily in every riparian habitat. That was sort of the intention of that. I'm not sure if
But within that riparian,
your question.
well, within that riparian habitat, they could end up in new locations. They're not just going to be stagnant in one location, correct?
The shrubs.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. On page 11, like lines 1 through 10, you discuss about having reviewed the California Essential Habitat Connectivity Project and the GIS layer of habitat connectivity. Was there existing barrier to wildlife movement in the area of the proposed reservoir? I mean, when the reservoir goes in there, obviously that's going to be a barrier. Are there barriers that exist currently to habitat? Wildlife movement?
I don't believe so. I mean, there are some roadways that would be like impediments to movement potentially, but not barriers.
Okay. Okay, and then at that page lines 9 through 10 says this information was used to determine the project's effect on wildlife corridors and connectivity. So what's your conclusions about the project's effect in wildlife corridors and connectivity?
So I had a few conclusions, some that were related to new roads and potential impacts related to those in terms of mortality and impediments to movement. We have mitigation to address those potential impacts, including studies for wildlife movement in those areas and implementing crossings and then monitoring those crossings and maintaining them. The other impact on wildlife corridors and connectivity is the reservoir itself, which, as you mentioned, is, quite a large barrier to movement. And the conclusion for that was a significant and unavoidable impact in the EIR/EIS.
And then on page 13, lines 14 to 16, you talk about that the completed reservoir would have beneficial effect on providing additional food sources for bald eagle and for yellow-breasted chat, yellow warbler, song sparrow, tricolored blackbird, and bats associated, insects associated with the reservoir. these species are currently on the project site now, is that correct?
They all have potential to occur. You know, again, without having surveys, you know, we're relying on data from eBird for the birds and some CNDB records, but there's definitely suitable habitat for those species. So yes, we expect that they likely occur on site.
And since this is an undisturbed area, is it safe to say that they could be, maybe for lack of a better term, occurring in some abundance, or in areas that are higher occurrence than, say, other areas that are impacted by human activity?
Yeah, these are, you know, grassland and oak woodland that's undisturbed. So we would expect these species to occur. They are all, you know, sensitive special status species. So they tend to be quite maybe not as abundant as common species. So they may not be super abundant, but there's definitely potential for them to occur.
So, okay. So if they are even not in a superabundance, but just abundant, how would basically removing 13,000 acres of their habitat, how would that benefit them?
Well, this was talking more about the benefit of adding food sources as a result of the reservoir. So fish that would be prey for bald eagle, and then the additional insect prey for the birds and the bats. So this was specifically talking about that, not about the removal of, you know, nesting and for other types of foraging habitat. That is addressed in another impact.
Okay. But the removal of the 13,000 acres of their habitat would impact them, correct?
Correct.
And it's removal of not just, say, nesting habitat, but as you indicated, foraging habitat.
For some species, yeah.
Does the reservoir provide them, with regards to food sources, does the reservoir provide them more food sources than currently exist?
I can say for sure that would be a pretty intensive study.
Page 16, lines 8 through 19. You talk about, you discuss the CDFW burrowing owl survey and mitigation guidelines of an example of how avoidance and minimization mitigation will reduce impacts. Can avoidance and minimization measures actually reduce the impacts to the spotted owl burrowing owl?
Yeah, the CDFW guidance for burrowing owl is pretty thorough. It has a lot of requirements for avoidance and minimization, and they have a compensatory mitigation requirement that's pretty rigorous. So I feel like, yes, if those mitigation measures are implemented, that they would avoid and minimize impacts on burrowing owl.
How do you avoid and minimize impacts of burrowing owl in the footprint of the actual reservoir?
So there's surveys to first identify if they're present. there's avoidance timeframes to avoid sensitive periods like the breeding season and overwintering period. There's buffers that can be implemented around nest sites to avoid disturbance. And then, you know, compensation for any loss. There's the process of relocating them, which I don't like, but it's allowed. It's part of the guidance that the owls can be relocated to other habitat that's not going to be impacted.
But their habitat, once the reservoir goes in, that habitat is lost to the burrowing owl, correct?
Correct.
But you haven't, the site ICF, or on behalf of Sites Project Authority, hasn't done any detection surveys yet. Is that correct?
Correct. At least not to my knowledge.
And you can't really implement the CDF guidelines until those detection surveys are completed, correct?
Correct. That's the first step.
Okay. Do you have an estimate of say 15,000 acres of burrowing owl habitat? How many pairs of burrowing owls that could accommodate?
I don't have an estimate. It's unlikely that that entire area would be occupied, though, just based on my experience with just surveys on other properties in California. There's definitely areas that look very suitable for burrowing owl, and they are not there. And then there's other areas that are highly disturbed and there's burrowing owls. So they kind of, I don't know how they pick where they burrow, but
Well, would you expect that it has the potential of accommodating maybe 200 or more pairs of burrowing owls over 15,000 acres?
I really couldn't say.
Well, if owls were in the area, I mean, if they were using it for habitat, as you said, in some areas it's hard to predict, and I understand that no surveys have been done. Well, let me rephrase that. Have any detection surveys been done at the project site, to your knowledge?
No. I mean, not unless they were part of that those surveys from many years ago.
Okay. And you don't recall if they were part of those surveys?
I don't, they may have been, I don't recall survey information for them.
Well, do you have an estimate of, I mean, if it is an area that burrowing owls are using in abundance, or I don't know if abundance is the right word, but an area they have chosen to use as their habitat. Do you have a rough estimate of how many pairs of owls 15,000 acres could support?
Objection asked and answered, and calls for speculation.
I think that's fair. I also think we may have exhausted the subject, Mr. Mooney. Do you have?
Okay.
All right.
Okay. it's my understanding that there's a one-to-one compensation for loss of golden eagle habitat. Is that accurate?
I believe that's correct.
And do you and is that for the 19,000 acres of the project site?
That would be refined based on the Eagle surveys and consultation with Fish and Wildlife Service for the Eagle permit.
Do you have any opinion as to where sufficient acreage can be found to compensate for that level of it, for the level of impact associated with the golden eagle habitat?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
So that's, I mean, it's potentially a lot of acreage, thousands and thousands of acres. Is that correct?
Correct.
As much as maybe 13,000 to 19,000 acres, correct?
I'd have to look and see what I put in the EIR EIS, but yeah, usually the acreage estimates were high in the document. Yes.
Okay. So and part of that mitigation is the purchase of conservation easements or fee title for that one-to-one compensation. Is that correct?
So for golden eagle, there would be compensation for loss of oak woodland. For take of eagle, I believe there's a I don't know the exact name of it, but it's a program for retrofitting transmission lines to prevent electrocution of eagles. Okay. So I think there would be a combination of mitigation.
Okay, I'm just focusing on the compensation for the loss of the habitat right now. Okay. Do you have an opinion as to where in the general vicinity of the project or in Northern California where there's sufficient acreage could be found that would be available for that type of conservation easement?
I don't. There's another team of people that are working on locating appropriate mitigation lands. But my expectation would be that that acreage might be reduced after surveys and more information is collected.
And that's part of the Eagle survey that you're mentioning earlier, the biologist that was the ICF that was performing?
Yes. Okay. But the surveys are a requirement of the mitigation measure.
Okay. If we could, I'm almost done here. If we could go back to sites 264. I'm not sure which. It is probably one. I think it's probably panel 6 or slide 6. And the last point there, and this just may be me being tired and having looked at too many documents and such, but your statement says, I did not conclude that these species would not occur or be affected by the project. Would it be safe to if I wanted to kind of clarify that, would it be accurate to say that you concluded that the species would occur and be affected by the project?
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to
Yes.
clarify that.
The two negatives in there, I could see that. But yes, the point was, yes, that I didn't exclude them from the analysis, nor did I say that they wouldn't be affected.
Okay. I think that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mooney. Are there other, we'll do a time check shortly, but are there other representatives with the coordinating NGOs who have questions for this panel? Dr. Curdy, do you have an estimate of how long you might have?
I'm thinking 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, great. Then let's proceed with you. Go ahead, Dr. Curdy.
Okay. A question, I guess for you, Ms. Weber. Is it correct, did I understand correctly, that the Sites Project Authority in some ways limited where you were able to collect data?
Prior to the preparation of the EIR, EIS, yes.
Okay. As a consultant, can you tell us what your professional and ethical responsibilities are?
In what regard?
Well,
I mean, could you narrow that a bit?
Yeah, all of us have professional training. Our disciplinary backgrounds all have certain ethical components of what we're supposed to follow. Previously, previous panel had discussed how, at least under the adaptive management plan, they follow the NRC's definition of best available science. And that within that, you're supposed to be objective, even though we never got a definition exactly of what objective means. And within that framework, also as a scientist, I assume this is an assumption on my part. I guess I should ask that question. Do you identify as a scientist?
Yes.
Okay, so within that context, your responsibilities to follow the principles, the practices, and your own logics of valid and sound knowledge production. So that's where I'm asking that question of what your professional and ethical responsibilities are.
Okay, well, I guess I'm interpreting this to mean with regard to preparing the EIR, EIS, that stage of the project.
Sure, let's leave it in that frame right now, since that's relied on quite a bit. Yeah, let's start from that. Yeah.
Yeah, so my responsibilities and ethics are to use the best information available to me in assessing what's in the project area and how those resources may be affected. That said, within the realm of that document, it's common practice that we don't have all the information available at that time. And so my requirement is then to make sure that I've disclosed the possible effects, but that I also require confirmation of those effects, which is why there are mitigation measures to conduct on the ground surveys before anything else can move forward and before, permitting can happen.
So within that context of trying to understand what the effects are and outlining appropriate mitigation, we are to understand, though, that you're supposed to act in an objective and neutral fashion as a self-defined scientist.
Yes.
In that case, should a project proponent in any way, shape, or form be in a position to influence you on what data you can and cannot look at?
No, and no one said that I couldn't look at any data. That's a different situation. As far as access to private property, that's a different category. It's not existing data. It's, its ability to be able to see it. And this happens frequently in large projects. And it's something that we just have to manage. And it's something that we have learned to manage in the CEQA realm, that sometimes we can't have everything that we want in order to assess the impact. So we use what we have, and then we say, this is what's missing. Therefore, mitigation will make sure that we fill these in. But we have enough information to adequately disclose these are the possible resources that might be affected.
So, two related questions, and perhaps this relates to Ms. Hale too. I believe there was testimony today that there were public areas that Sites Project Authority directed you to not access in terms of analysis and data collection. Was that not the case earlier today?
That's true.
So there was a directive to not collect data from certain areas, which could have perhaps further informed your models, further informed your analysis, given different information, revealed different variables that were not considered in the studies you conducted?
Objection, argumentative and lacks foundation.
I understand. Well, if you could, it's a good question. I'd like to hear the question. So Dr. Curdy, if you can try it again, but shorter, break it up, please.
Yeah. Were there potential pathways of data recovery and information production that could have informed your study that you did not pursue because of directives from the Site Project Authority?
There were limited pathways.
Okay.
I will further caveat that as I mentioned earlier, views from roadways would give some information, but most of this area is remote and it requires getting much further interior than the roadway allows.
So for Ms. Weber and Ms. Hale, my understanding was you followed certain guidance from Fish and Wildlife. Is that correct? Is this federal and state, or federal or state?
We followed guidance in what context?
I remember in your testimony, you had related something about CDFW. Is that correct? Can you give us the context once again to refresh my memory and my knowledge base of what you relied on from CDFW in your analyses?
So for me, I used information from CDFW for species occurrences, for information on existing wildlife corridor information, as well as for mitigation measures whenever either wildlife agency has either a written guidance for mitigation. I use that. I also used forgetting the name, the correct terminology for it, but there's guidance for giant garter snake that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has for the Corps that is not really in use anymore, but people still use the mitigation in that document. It's kind of the standard. So those were the ways that I used that data from, or information from those agencies.
Okay, Ms. Weber, same for you. Did you rely on any CDFW or any other sort of agency guidelines or data banks?
Well, as we mentioned, the excuse me, the California Natural Diversity Database provided information on occurrences of species. So I got species information from that. And then the other context where I might have mentioned it specifically was more their guidelines for surveys, and as the mitigation includes following their guidelines for on-the-ground surveys when those are conducted.
Okay, for both of you, I'm wondering within those practices of following those guidelines and interrogating the data, did you at all engage with the CDFW equity priorities and their JEDI principles?
Not familiar with
No.
that.
Were you inclusive of any indigenous knowledge in terms of understanding short and long-term impacts and the presence of species and the significance of species and what wider networks of relation and impacts those might have in determining reasonable impacts and defining what reasonable is?
That was a long list, but I will say, in general, it's true that at least in the botanical world of CEQA, we haven't generally used indigenous knowledge and information. And much of that has been, we have these chapters that parcel out subject matter, and the cultural resources sections of documents of this EIR, EIS are generally where information regarding indigenous people are presented.
So, Ms. Weber, is that a requirement of CEQA, or is that just an ongoing habit of CEQA?
Is what a requirement of CEQA?
That you do not incorporate indigenous knowledge in
that
other.
I personally, that as a botanist?
I think in CEQA as a process, because you mentioned CEQA and how things are usually done, correct? Understand that correctly. So is that a practice required by the CEQA process and related guidance, say from Office of Planning and Research, the Office of Historic Preservation, any other sort of California governmental institutional bodies that provide guidance on that? Or is that just how the practice has been, and so it just keeps being reproduced in the same way?
There's not a barrier to doing it per se. However, the analysis of effects under CEQA are guided by the CEQA guidelines. There's a group of questions in the CEQA guidelines with which you're probably familiar. And that is the scaffolding that's used to assess impacts. That's what's required to be assessed under CEQA.
So in your professional informed opinion, these type of significant impacts to the environment that we're speaking of, how that is usually done is under the cultural resources section?
With regard to?
Tribal associations, tribal relationships, natural resources as cultural resources, capacities for collective continuance, viable futures, indigenous knowledge application, species presence, short and long term, all those sorts of things, yes.
Yes, it has been historically.
Okay. Ms. Hale, same question. Is that your experience that this is usually done in a cultural resources section?
Yes.
Okay. So with those questions around those and the appropriateness in the cultural resources section, was there any conversation between and among your teams working on ground cover and on plant species and the cultural resource teams on how these may relate within indigenous cultural landscape?
Well, I think a lot of that is going to depend on the on-the-ground survey information, because it's going to be more specific, with my understanding anyway, of potential resources that are important to tribes. And so there's kind of a combination of these surveys going on at the time as we have access. There are cultural resource surveys occurring as well as biological surveys. But I am, unfortunately, I don't have the information exactly on what they have covered and whether or not they have covered the same places that we have so far.
So Dr. or Ms. Weber, one final question for you and the same question for Ms. Hale. Do you acknowledge that natural resources are cultural resources for affiliated tribes to the project area?
That natural resources are cultural resources. Yes.
Okay. Ms. Hale, same question. Do you acknowledge that?
Yeah, definitely. There's natural resources that are also cultural resources.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'll turn it back to you, Dr. Kinsey.
Thank you, Dr. Curdy. We're at 4:50, so I think we've earned our day. Let me, before we break though, I'd like to know if there are others from the coordinating NGOs who will have questions for this panel.
I will, Ms. Kinsey. I expect to have about half an hour, something like that.
Okay. Is there anyone else? And then on behalf of the Delta water users, Mr. Rees or Ms. Meserve, do you have questions?
I don't, and I don't believe Miss Meserve does, but she can correct me if I'm wrong.
Thanks. No, I don't expect to. If I did, it would be very short. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So it looks like we don't have too much left with this panel. My intent would be to pick up on Monday, complete our time with this panel, and then move to panel 9. I see Mr. King. I know you had questions for this panel. Is there something else you'd like to add? Mr. King, you have to go off mute. Oh. Are there other procedural issues we should address before we break for the week and reconvene on Monday?
This is Don Mooney. I was just going to say I will not be at the hearing on Monday. So for any recross or anything, Mr. Schutz or others can handle that.
Okay, thank you.
For me.
Anything else? Mr. King, are you able to get off mute? Maybe it was an errant hand. All right, then with that, thank you to all our witnesses today. I really appreciate it, and thank you to everyone here. We will reconvene. We're adjourned for the day, and we'll reconvene on, let me get the date right, Monday, September 23rd. I will see you on Zoom at 9 a.m. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.